Sri Aurobindo is describing a series of capital spiritual experiences in a sequence that leads us from something which is somewhat exclusive to something which becomes more and more complete until it reaches the point of integrality. But the background to this series is that he is describing how we may aim straight at a realization of pure self-existence in the highest mental plane, and from there embrace the whole of creation without losing our poise of that unity. But in the first effort, as we shoot into an exclusive focus on pure self-existence, there is a point where you break through to a great freedom in a great silence, a silence which is wide, inactive, no sense of originating, and the whole world appears then to be either unreal, illusory, or a kind of a meaningless ripple on something else which is so silent, so complete and one. At this point there are two options. One was to withdraw and bring down all our activities to the minimum, or the other option is to stay equal in a witness poise and allow the activities to continue as they have been. But here, he says, as one steps back and lives in that silence, the activity that continues is automatic. Led by what? And this is where we had paused last time, where he describes how it is possible for so much of human life to be lived by an external initiation. When you are not choosing to do, there are still things which work through you. Influences and actuations by other beings or emerging from subliminal or subconscious sources. But here, when the yogin takes this poise, who is actuating? And he writes something very interesting which we need to fully appreciate. But in this yogic status of action by the mere organs, Kevalair Indriyai, he is quoting from the Gita, it is the universal intelligence and will of nature itself working from centers superconscious and subconscious, as it acts in the mechanically purposeful energies of plant life or the inanimate material form. But here, with a living instrument who is the conscious witness of the action and instrumentation. So we saw this briefly last time, but we enter deeper into this discussion. In nature, capital N, suggesting that it is not just the surface mechanical nature, but even a kind of a purposeful, intentional nature, Mother Nature, who feels all the beings, living beings and non-living, as her own body, her own children, her own expression. This nature has an intention, has a will, which guides the overall development of things and processes. We saw last time, even processes that take place inside the cells, processes which take place in the atom and the molecule, are all her willing, slow, laborious over billions of years, but still willed by nature, and a universal intelligence, which is being universal, acting across the whole universe, across time, across space, everywhere. Now, an intelligence like this, which is universal, means the intelligence is aware of every single thing happening in the whole universe. And so, when it's moving to act in a single atom, the intelligence, is aware of the whole universe and its relationship with the atom. When it acts to move this, it is always in an overall harmony with the whole universe. When things change in the distant stars, the same intelligence is ensuring that things happen here in a way that we are protected from the great explosions, supernova or solar flash or whatever it is. In fact, with our growing knowledge of the universe and the solar system, we can only marvel at this extraordinary intelligence. If you just go back 30 or 40 years, the scientists observing our own solar system had such a weak and wrong idea of the planets and the sun and the relationships. They taught us, and it's still there in the textbooks, that Mercury being so close to the sun is so hot, it's boiling, it's melting, etc. And anything farther than Mars is too cold, Pluto would be all frozen, and so on. The reality which we discover today, Mercury has ice, water ice. Being so close to the sun, how does it manage that? And what we realize is there are layers of protection of various kinds, which are precisely extra in Mercury to make possible, although under influence of the sun in such proximity, to make possible places where life can exist, even human temperature and life. And the same with Venus. Although there are portions in Venus which are extremely hot, there are equally portions which are so cold that water is frozen there. If you have a hot place and a cold place, you have something in between, which would be perfect for life. And so it is all the way through up to even Pluto. Pluto has beautiful blue sky. They said it is so cold you get no light from the sun at all. But the reality, when we sent our spacecrafts, a blue, beautiful sky and such beautiful landscapes. Some of it frozen, some of it not. Somehow, over every planet, given enough time, this intelligence, universal intelligence and will of nature, has so adjusted things that life is possible. And this nature is looking far, far ahead, not at our typical 70, 80-year lifespan, not even at the cycle of a single civilization of a few hundred years, not even at the giant solar cycles of 24,000 years, but across millions, even billions of years. And she is working now for something which will happen after 1 billion years. And so around the earth we have this powerful magnetic field which is protecting the earth from all the radiation of the sun, just so balanced that life is possible. And if something is too close to the sun, the field is stronger over time. And if for some reason something does happen that extinguishes life, she can rebuild again and again, because she has all the time in the world, and all the processes of life are her willings. And so it is this universal intelligence and will of nature itself working in the yogin. Now the yogin's consciousness stands back and says, I am uninvolved, uninterested, and lets everything move. Who takes over? This universal intelligence. And you can imagine what that is capable of. And Sri Aurobindo points out this intelligence is working from centers superconscious and subconscious in the living instrument. And this we have to recognize what he means by this. There are two levels in our consciousness, and in between these two is our conscious range. Below the conscious is subconscious, above the conscious is superconscious, and in between is this very narrow band that we call I am conscious. It's so narrow that if you reduce the sugar in your blood by a few points, this consciousness is unable to survive, it goes into a coma. You increase it by a few points, it's unable to survive, it goes into a different kind of coma. It's a precarious, fine, narrow balance. And the character of this awareness is, I am conscious, I am doing, I am limited and narrow. In contrast to this very narrow piece of I, wandering and struggling, the subconscious is large. So large that when you enter into it, you can get overwhelmed. But it is not conscious of itself. And yet, it sustains most of our processes. If you observe the working of the human being, you decide, and we've seen this example many times, you decide, I'm going to drink water. After that point of decision, everything else is subconscious. I'm having a conversation, I reach out, raise the glass, drink, swallow, place it back in perfect balance. And if you had to replicate just this simple movement with a robot, you need artificial intelligence, which we have been struggling to develop for the last 30 years. And we still don't have the reliability that the human hand has in taking a sip of water. But it seems so simple. In actual fact, when you take a sip of water, there's such a complex process of the coordination of the lips and the tongue and the swallowing movement to ensure the water does not go into the lungs, which would be the easiest thing to happen. While I'm having a conversation, I drink water, I swallow, and it does not cross over into the wrong pipe. And it goes on all the way to the stomach. You eat a piece of food. The act of eating, chewing and swallowing is all mechanical. But what happens inside the stomach is humongously more complex. There is a whole intelligence which is then analyzing the content of the food, releasing different kinds of digestive juices depending on the kind of food, and going through the whole process of digestion for the next 6 to 12 hours. Digestion and absorption. Detecting when the food is not healthy, rejecting it, taking in as much as it needs and not taking in what it does not need. It's such a huge intelligence, all there, of which we are utterly unconscious. In fact, recent discoveries of studies of human biology bring us to the recognition that, in fact, in the abdominal region is the second largest bundle of nerve cells. The first largest is in the brain, the second largest is in the abdomen, and they are referring to it now as our second brain. The intelligence involved there is so great, it needs literally the structure, a brain-like structure around the intestines to ensure that all that process takes place automatically. All of this is subconscious. When a gymnast does a perfect cartwheel, the entire process is subconscious. If the gymnast tries to observe what she or he does, they will mess it up. And at some point in the very training, you have to learn to let go and allow the body to do what it needs to do. So much of our life is lived by the body doing it mechanically. Only when something fails, your intelligence is called to correct for it. Once in a while drinking and speaking, a little bit of the water spilt over into the lungs pipe. Instantly there was the reaction of the cough, which is also subconscious. You had to do nothing. Everything was corrected. But at that point you became momentarily conscious that you were careless while drinking water. But it didn't really matter because it was all happening automatically. When you're learning a new skill, you put a little bit of effort. After that again it goes into subconscious. How much of our physical life is really conscious? You would find something like 99+% is subconscious. So when he is speaking of this, the will of nature and the universal intelligence working from centers, superconscious and subconscious. So the large part of our life which is working through the subconscious is now taken over by the universal intelligence. In fact, if you look at it this way, it was always this universal intelligence which was really looking after the whole process. When we grow up, when exactly certain hormones have to be triggered so that we grow in particular sequence, that the body grows just enough and then the hormonal process stops. What controls that? Not our conscious control. Subconscious to us, but part of universal nature, which is operating on the species. And so when universal nature says, all right, this species now, I'm going to boost capacity, strength, intelligence, height, form, whatever it is, she wills it and the process starts. I have gone across, I have looked at some of the records we have in the ashram of the medical records of our students going back now more than 60 years. It is the single largest database in the world of medical records spanning the largest range for the longest duration. Even the WHO does not have studies going so far back and across such a large range. It is a treasure. And when they put the data on the computer some 15 years ago, and they did preliminary studies to analyze the trends, they found something extraordinary. Every decade, starting in the late 40s was when they started the measurements. Every decade, the average height of all the children, boys and girls, was increasing. And it's a straight line. From your side it will be like this, a steady curve, a steady line. 10 years later it's gone this much, 10 years later a little more, and a straight line practically, small variations. Interestingly, they map it now with boys and girls. So girls' average height is slightly shorter than the boys. So we have the two, let's starting this way. The boys are taller, girls are slightly shorter, average. And as we grow through the decades, both are growing, but the gap between the two is narrowing. Interesting. It's not because of environment, not because of food. The food given to them is exactly the same as it was 40 years ago. Minor variations. Quantity is the same. In fact, the nourishing quality has dropped ever since the Green Revolution. When they speeded up the growth of plants, you have a double crop in the year, but nutrition is half. And yet, you see this pattern. Across genetic types, you have a wide range of types, but the pattern is consistent. This narrowing gap between boys and girls reducing, but overall both growing taller. It's fascinating to see something like this. And then you relate it to what the mother says. She said that as the supramental force begins to work, well, she was asked, what would be the first signs of the supramental force working in matter? And she points to two things. Now this is not working in the mind, okay? It's just in matter. And so that all part belongs to the subconscious. First sign, she says, change in weather patterns. We are seeing that, and there are huge controversies. Some say there is a global warming, some say no, it is not a warming, some say it's part of a humanly created thing, some say it's part of a normal natural cycle. There are places where it's getting colder, In the Antarctic there are regions where the ice is growing, in the Arctic it's melting. Nobody really knows for sure. When you measure from the ground, you find things are warming. When you measure from the satellites, you find things are cooling. You have snow in places which were desert and other places which are becoming desert. And Mother's explanation was interesting. And this she has said in the 60s, long before these studies came up. She said, the world weather patterns will change to become more temperate. That means the places which are too cold will become warmer, the places which are too hot will become cooler. So that the whole earth overall will become more temperate, more comfortable. The extremes of the seasonal variations would become less. Why? Because that's the action of the supramental force, to bring more harmony, less conflict. It's an obvious conclusion, isn't it? But of course, in any change of patterns, remember nature works with 1 billion years ahead, and this is happening in an accelerated pace within a few decades. That's a hugely accelerated pace. So in any rapid change, you will have fluctuations, you will have imbalances. And of course, there are humanly created interventions which are influencing the weather. You create a city by cutting down a forest. Well, you are going to influence the local weather. You plant trees, you will influence local weather. We are doing that all the time. And it's not just carbon dioxide, we are throwing poisons, we are killing life. But nature is compensating for all this. And the supramental force working through this nature is modifying things as rapidly as possible, Mother said, without breaking it down. You see, if you make a change too fast, the systems break down. If you go too slow, then well, it's too slow, we are in a hurry. Humanity won't survive. If the changes don't happen fast enough, we might even have a catastrophic breakdown of life on earth. And so there's a fine balance. Things have to move fast enough that we don't destroy everything. And yet if you go too fast, you might end up disbalancing and thus destroying. And Mother said the supramental force is working exactly as necessary to keep this fine balance. And the result is this change in weather patterns. But the second change Mother referred to is also interesting. She said it would be a change in the human body. And this would be seen in those who particularly work on the body consciousness. It would be seen first. And the change would be that the distinction between the male and female form would become less. And she pointed to gymnasts and athletes in whom you would first see this happening. And it's our experience when we look at the gymnasts in the Olympics or in any other championships that you often cannot make out if it's a boy or a girl. It's one thing that many of the gymnasts are very young because the body is plastic and able to do much more when it's young. But even after, because they've been through that training, even after, it's difficult to make out. Yes, there is a difference. But the difference is fine. And there is a kind of an aesthetic elegance of something which is almost androgynous. And Mother referred to this in the 60s because she saw what the supramental force was doing. But how is the supramental force working? Through the subconscious processes in your body. None of us have tried to change our body. None of us have tried to think, oh, the next generation should be whatever, taller, or the difference between men and women to be less. Nothing of that sort has happened. So it is a superconscious force working through a subconscious energy and process. And so I take these examples precisely because it helps us to understand what Sri Aurobindo is speaking of here. He says, the universal intelligence and will of nature itself working from centers superconscious and subconscious, working from both. The large part, as we saw, 99+%, is subconscious. But when a superconscious action descends, it works in part directly, in part through the subconscious processes. So in the human being, for example, We have the action taking place in our body which is utterly unconscious to us, even though it is the supramental force working in matter. But the same force is also working in our mind. There we can be conscious if we make a little bit of effort, or in our hearts. And we notice this shift taking place, particularly accentuated in the last 20 years, that in the younger generations, the character of the mind is different somehow. It is naturally inquisitive widely. All children are inquisitive, but this mind wants to reach out widely. It wants to know everything about everything in the world. So they watch television, they go on the internet, they educate themselves by exposing widely. And the same mind does not feel comfortable in a narrow system, narrow belief, narrow box. It does not want to be boxed up. When something appears which is different, instead of recoiling in fear, it says, I want to know. Compare this with the mind, let's say 40 or 50 years ago, when if a type is formed or a culture is formed and it meets something different or contrary, it backs off and says they are different, the enemy, the opposite, the other, and it protected itself. Suddenly that has shifted. Now it says, oh, how do they think? What do they do? And you reach out to interchange. And again, this has not happened because of any educational system, government policy, or any attempt in any culture or community to consciously develop. It's happened in spite of people. And it's the action of the supramental force on the human mind, making it wider, freer, more plastic. And the same with our energies, with our emotions. The sense of connection across barriers, what were barriers before, that sense of connection is growing far more rapidly than anybody can prevent. Everywhere governments, communities, cultures are trying to block it, to protect their young, to protect their values, their traditions, their belief systems, whatever it is. But the connections are forming in spite of such efforts. We have reached a point where we are unable to prevent, unable to stop, unable to hide. And this is again a comment that the mother had made. As the action of the supramental force grows more and more direct, a time will come, she said, when you will not be able to keep secrets. Interesting. We see how it's working out today. Everything from WikiLeaks, hackings, to the alternate media and social connections in social media, by which things are passed around in ways that the powers that used to control humanity are unable to. And again, this was possible because the mind has shifted sufficiently that you want to reach out, you want to connect. If it had been the same mind, even with the internet existing, it would have kept its own little protected domains. The internet would have been itself fragmented. But something inside the mind is reaching out, widening, at the cost of depth. This is the interesting thing. And you see the children today, they know a little bit about everything, but they don't go deep. They cannot as if go deep. They're unable to concentrate in depth. And this is a temporary passage. First, the mind has to focus on what it wants to develop. It exaggerates that focus until it has sufficiently established it so it won't lose it. Then it turns back to what it has lost, or only momentarily lost, and reintegrates with the depth. And then suddenly you will have a mind which will be able to do both. Rapidly go in depth in a wide space. That will be what we will see in the immediate generations, children who are now in the age 5 and less. And all of this is happening within our lifetime. We have never seen such rapid progress in human evolution in the quality of the mind and even in the physical development. And so all of this points to something extraordinary. So although we are speaking here of an individual experience, the fact that in fact within us two things are working, that we can appreciate also in a larger context. What is working? Subconscious centers through which the universal intelligence acts, superconscious centers through which the superconscious, supramental power acts. And he says, in the same way as it's working in plant life or material forms which are inanimate, the same universal energy is working. Now that acts in you. Except that here is a living instrument who is the conscious witness of the action and instrumentation. So you as a conscious witness are watching this universal action going on through you. And two things, action and instrumentation. The action comes and your intelligence, your body, your emotions are used. So a yogi who is living in this poise, if he is asked, oh, you did a wonderful thing, he will say, it was nature, I didn't do it. It's the working of nature. Or if he is conscious of the higher working and the superconscious action, he will say, oh, it was an act of the Divine Mother. It was her gift, it was her action, Divine Shakti, God, whatever form of vocabulary he may use. Ramana Maharshi had many interesting observations of this kind in his vocabulary. One of the peculiar features of his communications was that he never used the word I. He would point and say this, meaning, because in his consciousness, what do you call this bundle, this little whirlpool of energy that is the individual? From a consciousness which is living, which is so wide and free, even universal, infinite, little whirlpool here, this, you are not it, isn't it? So how do you say this? This person. So there are many saints we know of traditionally who have had a vocabulary which is like this because there is no other way to express themselves. In their experience, all that's happening is being done automatically. They are not initiating, they are not participating. At best, they are witness. And so, conscious witness of the action and instrumentation. This is the instrument being used, fine. And then Sri Aurobindo explains, in this situation, it is a remarkable fact that the speech, writing and intelligent actions of such a state may convey a perfect force of thought, luminous, faultless, logical, inspired, perfectly adapting means to ends, far beyond what the man himself could have done in his old normal poise of mind and will and capacity. Yet all the time he himself perceives, but does not conceive the thought that comes to him. So if you had asked Ramana Maharshi as he was before he entered this poise and asked him to do certain things, it would have been far less in capacity. Being in this poise, it is not his limited capacity, but this larger universal intelligence and nature working, which can do so much more. Many things would happen spontaneously. He would suddenly say, oh, today we have to prepare so much more food for 20 people. And why so much? Wouldn't it be wasted? And as it turns out, as they begin to serve the food, a group of 20 people come in a bus unannounced. And the food just happens to be ready. So you'll say, miracle. No, not really. For the universal intelligence which was operating across, conscious of these people and their coming, it was the most normal thing to do. He himself never initiated it. It was done through him, through his instrumentation. So Sri Aurobindo is using three types of activity he describes: speech, writing, and intelligent actions. Now such a person might speak, might write or act, and it will be done with an extraordinary capacity, more than he could by a conscious volition. And that's the reason why you see often these saints who did not go through formal education of any kind, no formal study of philosophies, no formal study of languages or any other special skills or faculties of mind developed. And yet when challenged by circumstance, they could flawlessly argue out philosophies, logically, even sometimes transcending logic. Ramakrishna Paramahansa would give examples which were so simple from the life of the village around, and yet so direct, touching, moving, and often responding to complex philosophical questions with a simple example, a simple reply. And you'll say, oh, this man has so much wisdom. But to his consciousness, it's being done. He is not doing it. So, speech, writing, and intelligent actions, everything can go on. And he describes in what way they are different. Perfect force of thought. So we go through the 6 items he mentions. The first thing you would expect is, if I am not initiating, if I am not making an effort, if I don't decide I will do this, where will the force come? Force in action, force in thought, force in speech. Because if it's happening automatically, well, it would be like the water flowing. I don't put myself in it, isn't it? We think that only when we push, when we hit, when we try strongly with our effort, can we really act. And the reality is this: when we push, our energy is so small, so weak. It is our incapacity which is being expressed. Instead, when we let go and allow something greater to act, far more is achieved. We have the examples again of inspired people. In the case of Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc in France, the kind of power that surged through her, if she had attempted it on her own strength, it would have been impossible. She stands before an entire army, all alone, and tells them that I see all of you dead in a sea of blood, and tells them better go back if you want to survive. And they all accept and turn around and walk away. Can you believe that? It's not the words she spoke. And had she put her own energy of conviction, it would have been a little frail girl who's not even a trained warrior, talking to an army and sending them away. And these are battle-hardened, insensitive, desensitized people. They would have just blasted her aside. And it was not her, it was the power that worked through her and surging through her instrument, blowing through. Far more than any human being can ever, by conscious effort, express. So such is the grandeur of the power that can act. And so the first thing he is referring to is this perfect force of thought, luminous, faultless, logical, inspired, perfectly adapting. So there is the force of thought, and then there is the luminosity, the clarity. When she spoke, they saw what she saw. It was obvious. There was no doubt. Logic could not confuse that obviousness of it. The luminosity was so complete. And the speech spoken, perfect, faultless, or the action in the writing, whatever form it takes, perfect and faultless. This we have experienced sometimes in our own lives when we sit down to write poetry. And we experience 2 kinds of poetry. The type which we struggle to construct. You try to fit words, fit ideas, and somehow kludge forms. It's as if pieces joined. And then there are times when the poetry catches you and it struggles to push through, and you only have to allow it You don't even know pretty much what you're writing, it just goes through. And when it's finished, you look at it, perfect rhythm, perfect rhyme, perfect flow of thought, and you say, wow, I didn't write that, it was inspired. Nirudh Baran, Sri Aurobindo's assistant, he sometimes would have these movements of poetry. He would write and send it to Sri Aurobindo with a message, Guru, please explain what I have written, I don't understand it. So there's an inspiration which acts, and it is faultless. It can keep its logic, and the inspiration, it's inspired and perfectly adapting means to ends. And here's the interesting thing, we're speaking of something like poetry. What is the vocabulary that can come through in this case? Only the words you know, isn't it? It can't throw out a word that you didn't know. So the means available is the language that is already there in your, let's say, brain, in your physical mind. Anything outside that is not available as a resource. But what is interesting, when the inspired poetry comes, it throws out words which are not part of your normal vocabulary. You know those words, but you've even forgotten those words. If you were asked, what is that word's meaning? You're not quite sure. But when the inspired poetry flows, the inspiration pulls those words, pulls the things you have forgotten from within your mind, brings it forward, and as you write, the meaning of that word is lit up. You know what it means. Or as in his case, you're not quite sure, but you know it's the right word. You've just written it. And then you look up the meaning in the dictionary and you find it was the perfect word. But it picks it out from what is available. The same inspiration, when it works in action in the life, it picks out the resources available, including resources you did not notice. You did not remember where in your godown or dungeon, capacities, people, connections, it pulls everything together, works it out. So when Mother used to work through people, she would push them with this kind of inspiration. It would pick out the capacities inside them, and suddenly they would find themselves capable of so much more if they did not interfere, if they allowed the action to flow through. And when they did, you had this extraordinary poetry, music, painting, or creation, or action. I remember an incident narrated by Udarda. He was supposed to help some person who was visiting the ashram from Europe, a lady who had come looking for, she was wandering over India, looking for some saint who will help her to get back her hair, which was falling. Okay, that was her interest. She wanted a magical intervention for hair growth. Somehow, she had got hold of the ashram's address. She was in touch with Udar through some person. And so she came, and she was on, I don't remember what it was, whether it was a hand cart or a horse carriage. They came to the ashram gate. Udar was to receive them. And she was in such distress, having seen poverty and all kinds of uncomfortable circumstances. And she said, I'm fed up, there's nothing here which can help me. I'm not going to get down, I'm leaving right now. And Udar says, he had this strong urge inside him to say, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich woman to enter the gates of heaven. Now this is a biblical quote, slightly modified. Just like that. And he said, what a strange thing. And he restrained himself. The woman left. He went and reported to the mother, and mother said, oh, you were a fool. I put those words in your mouth. Had you spoken them, her entire life would have been changed. But when it comes, it sounded so weird. For her, it was the right thing she needed to hear because it was from within her religious and cultural context. And it would have awakened, and the force which was put behind the words would have awakened something in her. The instrument had the capacity, he had that background of that vocabulary. It caught him, but there was a resistance. And the reality is this: when we begin to work consciously to tap on a higher inspiration, we realize that the less we interfere, the better the things are. The more we get out of the way, the more perfect the action is. And a large part of the training of the master, musician, artist, creator, whatever form it takes, is really get yourself out of the way. To put it in more crude terms, your ego is what is interfering. But when people say ego, then they misunderstand that word. So I'm avoiding that word ego. I'm just saying you get yourself out. I may share my own experience in this matter. When I first started speaking in lectures in the school, I would prepare with great detail what needed to be said, what were the ideas I wanted to put together. I would assemble them, arrange them in some logical sequence, and think of what words I would use to articulate those ideas, what examples. So I was a bit used to that kind of preparation because at that time I had never done it. And later on, as I was going into other kinds of lectures, I would still do that kind of a structure, and I would have my notes with me. And then it would happen every once in a while, when I had regular classes, that I didn't have time to prepare. And so I would just throw in 2 or 3 ideas, but I had to catch myself in the flow. And in each of those cases, I found what came through was far better. Better than I could have if I had sat down and listed out and made notes and planned it out. Except that to not do that seemed dangerous, risky, because then I would be lost. And there was a whole period of shifting between these 2 kinds of preparation, until gradually a kind of a reliance and trust developed in the inspiration. And then I realized the quality of the inspiration depended not so much on my preparation, sometimes that was useful for factual data, but on the state of consciousness. And then I found it took me sometimes several hours to get myself into the right state so that it could flow through without disturbance. Complete stillness of the emotions, complete silence in the mind, complete removal of yourself. And to the extent that these efforts were successful, what flowed through would be interesting and sometimes perfectly structured. It's as if the tail end would link up with the beginning and there would be a clear logical flow, although I had not planned any of it consciously. And so I found the transition itself was a bit risky. You want to be, in your old way of being, relying on your personal effort, personal logic, structure, plan, etc. And here is something which is without anything, complete blank, in which you allow something to flow. And how do you make that transition? But the same thing would apply even in action. To be able to do a painting with no prior concept of what you want to do, or plan of what it should be about, or the theme, to let your hand pick up the brush and go and develop, and at the end have a complete, perfect, beautiful painting. It's scary, isn't it, at first? But you can take that risk, try it out a few times. Eventually, though, a transition is made from the old way of being to the new way of being, where you rely much more on a higher inspiration. And then you notice there are parts in you which kick in sometimes, which block, which interfere. And you learn bit by bit to restrain, to calm and habituate those parts to be in a different relationship. So one can take up any activity of life, the most simple, the most ordinary seeming, and deliberately help to make this transition from a poise of I am doing with my own plan, strategy, personal effort, to a conscious effort to opening, calling upon a higher inspiration to act and work through you, to do the same thing or anything else it chooses in its way, any activity, including sweeping the floor, cooking food, even complex things like writing, speaking, gymnastics, dance, painting, music. The success will be to the extent that you're able to remove yourself in all the parts through which the inspiration has to pass through. If it is only in the domain of thought, it will be from mind to your hand or your speech. If it is in a painting, it will pass through your hand also. Mother observed that when Sri Aurobindo was writing the Arya, he was writing from the silent mind, meaning his intelligent mind was completely silent. And then she said, she saw the inspiration go straight through him into his hands as he was typing. Now it's not automatic writing, he is fully conscious. His poise is in the consciousness from where it's flowing. But he is not forming, he is not formulating, he is not personally intending. It's rather the knowledge flows through him and takes its own spontaneous, perfect form. But of course, obviously he is doing it from a superconscious level. And in a large part, he spoke of it when he wrote the Arya. He was writing from the higher mind, but he had already achieved the higher ranges of consciousness, even with the initial experiences of the supramental consciousness. So even though he was primarily poised there, he was able to open to a much higher source, which would work through. Another example which comes to mind is Kapali Shastriyar, who was working in the housing construction department in the ashram, and one of the responsibilities given to him was with the paints. And in those days you did not buy a range of colors. Today you can go with a Pantone color match and get a box of paint. Those were days when things were not so much in plenty. You bought 2 or 3 basic colors and mixed them in correct proportions to get the shade that you wanted. And so one of the things he had to do was to mix the paints, for which you have to take exact quantities. His physical consciousness had been sufficiently intuitivized that he would pick up like that, and it was the exact amount. You could weigh it to confirm it was exact to the gram. Now, this cannot be done with your conscious mind. Try to get an exact amount. Your eyes will be watching the level, your hands will be trying to feel the weight, your mind will be worried, is it more, is it too less, what was my past experience, is it matching that? And all this activity is screening what could otherwise be a spontaneous movement. And sometimes it happens to us when we are distracted. We do the thing and it was perfect. It was just right in number. You pick up a sheaf of paper, it's exactly the number that you needed. You're writing something, you end with the last page on the last line, perfectly. Spontaneously. It happens and you say, but it's an aberration, it's not normal. We can transition from this mindset of I doing to one of the spontaneously perfect action. But there's a passage in between, you have to let go this, but you don't have that yet. And you have to trust and you have to experiment. And the skill is making yourself quiet. Now I'm not digressing, it is related to what we are speaking, but I'm showing how this truth, which Sri Aurobindo is describing in the perfect poise of the yogi, is applicable to us even as we are, on different levels or different degrees of stillness. So here he is describing a consciousness which is completely identified with the pure existence of the self. And that is the extreme. But the truth of it reflects on so many levels in us. So as a first step, you will find, if you make your emotions quiet, make your heart still, personal anxieties, personal fears, personal desires, make them completely quiet. Your mind may be active, the rest of you is active, but here in the emotions you make yourself still as a first base. And you will find already what you do is better done. More spontaneous, less agitated, less disturbed, things happen more smoothly. Second step, you learn to make your mind quiet. Quieten your thoughts. Maybe not perfectly silent, but to the extent that you're able to quiet, you can think what you want when you want, without having a clutter of ideas pulling, pushing, confusing, doubting. That vanishes. Instead, you think, you do, and already the quality of what you do is much better. And from there, it's a small step to make the mind quiet and wait, call upon the inspiration, and let it flow. If it is an activity which you are already familiar with, you have trained, the thing becomes so much easier because the instrument has been already prepared. If it is not, then there's a bit of a struggle because now the instrument is through the body consciousness. There is a little bit of a hiccup. And there you may have to either practice, or over time with practice it becomes better, until eventually the body consciousness or some part of the mind in the body is similarly attuned and silent, and the body can do. And at that point you will find the things happening almost spontaneously. Then there's one more step you can take. We're not yet speaking of the self here. Just with this silent instrument, one more step, you, who is pretty much a witness here, a mental witness, you can consciously invoke a higher inspiration. Make a conscious effort to shift your state to attune to a higher or deeper inner state. So you take a few moments to concentrate, shift within, open, invoke the mother's presence, call for her help wordlessly. Not, "Mother, please help me, Mother." No, that's the agitation which is going to come in the way of the action. You become very quiet and still and just open to her and simply invoke her inspiration. I'm reminded of an incident which is narrated by Narad. He was training a choir in the ashram to sing in the 60s, I think, mid-60s. And he had prepared for a whole month. They had been practicing in the room, and on his request, Mother accepted to listen to them. So they were to stand near the samadhi and sing, and Mother came down through the window just above the samadhi. She stood there. And then suddenly they realized they had never practiced in the open. There was a breeze, they couldn't hear each other. And the first effort that they made, it was such a horrible cacophony. Narad felt utterly ashamed. And then he says, he turned to the mother and pleaded with her, "Mother, this is your choir, you lead us." And you see, you put yourself out of the picture. And then again he started, and this time he said it was so beautiful, so perfect. It had never been so good even in their practice. Just that one shift, consciously calling the higher inspiration. In the very act of calling, you are reducing your participation and making yourself consciously an instrument. And the result is something can come through which is of a very high inspiration, extraordinary often in its result. But initially when that happens, something in you starts jumping, "Oh, it's happening," and that tends to break it. And so the training to remain quiet and receptive. Now this can further then go in the direction of what we are reading. You step back and feel the presence of the Divine Mother or the Self, whatever aspect of it, the silence, and lean back to rest in it and let that stillness and silence invade your whole being, your mind, and bring it to stillness of a depth which you could not have done just by quieting. And then there's even a character of a kind of a power which can come through in that silence or peace. And then there is of course the state which is described here, where you are consciously, entirely focused on the pure existence of the self, and then you have this experience of all this happening by the action of this intelligence universal and the will of nature, working through centers superconscious and subconscious, and with the perfect force of thought, luminous, faultless, logical, inspired, perfectly adapting means to ends, and anything available is used to get to the result required. Far beyond what the man himself could have done in his old normal poise of mind and will and capacity. Yet, all the time he himself perceives, but does not conceive the thought that comes to him. He watches, the thought comes, I didn't think it, it came. So when you have this inspired writing or speech or action, and as it's happening, you, the observing consciousness, is saying, that's interesting, that's so beautifully put, I couldn't have said it. Oh, that I didn't know that is interesting insight. There are a series of insights and insights coming from the intuition and the form in which it articulates itself, and you say, wow, wonderful. So in a sense, you are watching what the divine or the higher consciousness shares and expresses. But it's not automatic writing. It is a very conscious state of attunement to a higher state of consciousness. So the thoughts you do not conceive, but you perceive, and then observes in its work, but does not appropriate or use the will that acts through him. So he's observing the will that is working, but you don't get in and say, I am doing. It's an inspired will. Witnesses, but does not claim as his own the powers which play upon the world through him, as through a passive channel. Something is working in the environment and it works. You couldn't have done it, and you know that, and you just observe. And you will find this happening. All of us have had moments when this has happened. You're sitting with somebody whom you want to help, and sometimes you say a word, or you're just sitting there, you remember the mother, you feel the divine presence, and something happens. Suddenly the person changes, their internal state changes, the situation changes. Even a problem you're struggling with suddenly dissolves or shifts in a way, and you didn't do anything other than feel, remember, or invoke. And it is the power which was invoked which did, and you're aware of that, because you couldn't have done. And you can even feel the power working and changing. Play upon the world through him as through a passive channel. What's the scope? So when we are working in our little narrow consciousness, well, the power working through us can act as far as it wants. When we are entirely not present and the consciousness is immersed in that which is infinite, timeless, spaceless even, what is the scope of the action? You are aware of an action taking place on the world in exactly the same way, but with far greater power. Sri Aurobindo makes this comment somewhere, I don't know if I have it here, that regarding his influence on the world events, and where he says that I have not known my will to fail in any circumstances in the world events, even if sometimes it takes time. Here it is. He says he didn't leave politics because he couldn't do more. He could have done much more, but a different assignment was given to him and it would have interfered with that assignment. And he says, I had foreseen the ultimate triumph of the movement I had initiated, was sure, without my personal action or presence. And then he says, there was not the least motive of despair or sense of futility behind my withdrawal. For the rest, I have never known any will of mine for any major event in the conduct of the world affairs to fail in the end, although it may take a long time for the world forces to fulfill it. So here is when he says, will of mine. Now, what is the will here? It's not this personal will, because already at that point he has entered into a consciousness which is no more personal. It is free of personal ego. And it is an action working through him, acting on the world's events. And the world forces are led to work and fulfill once the will is initiated. Here in this case, it's not the universal will, it is a superconscious and divine will which is leading. As for the possibility of failure in my spiritual work, I shall deal with that another time. But the summary he gives, difficulties there are, but I see no cause for pessimism or for the certification of failure. But elsewhere he says with much greater force, he speaks of the inevitability of what has to happen, because precisely that's how it is. The circumstances in the universe and in terrestrial evolution are at such a point, this has to happen. It's only a question of how. Maybe if I can find that text. So he says that the only possibility, the only doubt is whether it will be through a crashing circumstances, or whether it will be through a conscious choice. I think this is from the mother, where she speaks of this. So anyway, we'll leave it at that then. So she mentions here how the inevitability of what has to happen in terms of the evolutionary development and the change in human society and the spiritualization of humanity and the result of that in the human development. She says it is certain that it will happen. The only question is whether it will be by a willing choice that humanity makes to change, or whether it will be through the pressure of crashing circumstances. And that is really the challenge before us. I think it will be worth reading this if I can find it. Let me take a moment. And it is at that point that she makes also the reference during that period to the creation of Auroville, which was a necessity precisely to help in this conscious, deliberate choice in the transition. So we'll leave it. So when Sri Aurobindo was working in this way, through him the impact would be on the world forces. The will acts and the forces are now compelled, and they have to work within the circumstances given. And this word he has used, perfectly adapting means to ends. And we have to understand what that means. Whatever is available, these are your means. The ends are what you are seeking to realize. Sometimes the means available do not appear to be sufficient to get to the end. And yet, when a higher intelligence sees it can rearrange the same means to bring out of them something far greater. And the ends are sure to be realized in spite of insufficient or limited means. Going back again to the example of Joan of Arc, what was the means she had? Not the strength of her army, not her skill of sword, not her skill of speech. The only means available was, here is one instrument who is open and receptive, selfless. And the divine can intervene through just that one point of support to achieve what then appears almost miraculous. The same intervention could have happened through other means. If this instrument was not there, then it would be through the strength of the soldiers on the battlefield, through their weapons and so on. And it would not be so obviously a miracle perhaps. Or as we find occasionally, we have a small group, 10 or 15 people, battling and preventing the advance of 1,000. And obviously it's a miracle. And yet, at that moment, we just see the heroism and the skill and the courage, the intelligence and all the things they did, which is as if raising the human possibility to a level extraordinary, and then they fall back. And we say, these were great heroes. And the same people afterwards in life, they seem so ordinary, sometimes with such pettiness, that you say, how can a hero behave like this? Well, they were hero only because they were lifted up at that moment by that higher power. It doesn't mean it stays or that they are able to carry it or sustain all the time. But the experience of this witness is that there's a play upon the world through him as through a passive channel. When Ramana Maharshi was asked, why don't you participate in the struggle for India's freedom from colonial rule? He simply said, how do you know we are not participating? It's a different kind of action, not necessarily obvious to the surface sight. He does not go around making speeches, but through him the power can work to act on those who are making the speeches, on those who are listening to the speeches and feel suddenly inspired, those who are working in little corners to make small efforts, sometimes even intervening to protect them from danger of all kinds. And the power still acts through instruments who may never be seen. I think Mother makes this comment in the action of the avatar. She says, he does his work which is primarily that of a change of consciousness. And even if he was sitting all alone in a prison cell, unknown to anybody, the work would have been done for humanity. Because the change of consciousness, which is an internal process, and through him, in its impact on humanity, that does not need any external device and means. Where necessary, he may use people working in their own fields, inspiring them, guiding, helping and working through them by giving precisely such kind of support. So this is what he is referring to in terms of the action through a passive channel. But this phenomenon, he says, is not really abnormal or contrary to the general law of things. So far what we have seen is, he said it is a remarkable fact that all this can happen through somebody without a personal will. But then he now explains that this is not so remarkable if you think about it differently, and he gives us a perspective. For do we not see a perfect working of the secret universal will and intelligence in the apparently brute action of material nature? So the analogy is not for us so obvious, because we tend to think of the mechanical action in nature to be, well, that's how it is. But if you think about it deeper, it's actually being led by this universal intelligence, which makes for things to happen. If you observe, an object collides and hits another. This first object almost stops, the second object is kicked forward. The physicist will say, your velocity multiplied by your mass is matching the velocity here multiplied by the mass. Why? Oh, I don't know, that's how it is. Or he will say, that's a law of physics. Who made the law? Who ensures it is followed? And the physicist says, that's not my domain. But the reality is, when this collision happens, and there is a transfer of something, and it all happens with the perfect balance of forces, there is an intelligence involved. Because that intelligence works in the flow of energies, therefore the law of physics is conserved. Because it chooses to conserve it. If you look at the reality, there is no physical object, there is only a whirl of energy. Whirl of energy colliding with a whirl of energy need not create this. It can just blur and merge, dissolve, right? That it chooses to not dissolve but to transfer force. That is the action of the universal intelligence. For do we not see a perfect working of the secret universal will and intelligence in the apparently brute action of material nature? And it is precisely this universal will and intelligence which thus acts through the calm, indifferent and inwardly silent yogin, who offers no obstacle of limited and ignorant personal will and intelligence to its operations. He is comparing these two. And there's a very interesting suggestion in the comparison. You see, physical matter, a stone, is not offering any personal resistance to the action of the universal will and intelligence. This yogin also is not offering any personal intervention or resistance. He is comparing the two in their similarity. Of course, this person is conscious, utterly conscious as one could ever be. But he is like the stone, offering no resistance and distortion. Calm, indifferent, inwardly silent, no obstacle. What is the nature of the obstacle? Limited and ignorant personal will and intelligence. When the universal intelligence and will works through an individual, the individual puts in between his individual intelligence and individual will, which are not only limited, they are also ignorant. They don't know what is best. With all the best good intention and capacity, you try to do what you think will be helpful. While the deeper action comes and says, no, that's not the best way. But you can't hear it, and you are unwilling to let go. I have to do my best. You're so busy thinking of yourself and your effort, you do not even listen or feel the higher inspiration warning, guiding or showing you a better way. And only when this fails, you give up. Suddenly, what about that? When you became quiet and gave up and you were silent, momentarily there was a chance for the inspiration to rise in you and you say, I have a brilliant idea. You go that way. But perhaps that was waiting all along, waiting for you to become quiet, to listen. But in terms of similarity, these two are equivalent, and so the universal intelligence and will can be as perfect as it is working here in the brute matter. He dwells in the silent self. He allows the active Brahman to work through his natural instruments, accepting impartially, without participation, the formations of its universal force and knowledge. So again he brings us back, reminding us to this double status. The consciousness is silent, the activity is happening. We still have a gap, and it is not yet healed. The integrality is not yet found. And now Sri Aurobindo comes to this question. First of all, we recognize this poise is extremely valuable. It is a great experience. It is a capital experience in the spiritual development, but it's not the end. And so he will show us what is the benefit of this poise, and then we will move to what next. This status of an inner passivity and an outer action, independent of each other, is a state of entire spiritual freedom. You are free. Even in action you are free. And what does that mean? He explains. The yogin, as the Gita says, even in acting does no actions. For it is not he but universal nature directed by the Lord of nature which is at work. So I didn't do anything. It was done through me. And this is what Sri Krishna, the reference to Gita here, this is what Sri Krishna is telling Arjuna in the battlefield of life. Just now, the biggest battle in history is about to take place. People on both sides are friends, relatives, brothers and sisters, and suddenly they are pitted one against the other. And Arjuna is the center of the whole action. He represents at that point the leader in humanity, the one person who is selected to represent the whole effort and struggle of humanity, the best of humanity. And he gives up, unable to enter into this battle. And step by step, Sri Krishna leads him to get free of his condition. And then towards the end, he comes to this recognition that you have to be a conscious instrument. The action will be done not by you, but by the divine will working through you. You will be in this poise. And as a result, there will be no karmic consequence, neither upon you nor on the circumstances. Now here is the greatest massacre about to take place. The armies are going to exterminate each other. And at the end of the Mahabharata, not a single Kshatriya is left alive. Sri Aurobindo explains in one of his very insightful articles, the purpose in this whole battle. Sri Krishna had set a purpose. You must recognize this took place about 5,000 years ago, 3,100 BC sometime. And at that point, Sri Aurobindo observes, Sri Krishna had two objectives. One was to clean out the Kshatriya clan, which had become too hardened and narrow that they were preventing a greater possibility from emerging. So the Kshatriyas are destroyed in the process. But on the other side, setting the foundation for the national identity. And for which purpose, Sri Krishna ensured that nobody was left out from the battle. Nobody could escape, nobody could avoid. Anybody who was neutral was somehow compelled to take a stance. Even in neutrality, you had to say for or against. In the act of being neutral, you were against the truth. That's the challenge of evolution. There comes a time in life where you don't have a choice. To sit silent is to accept the falsehood. But when you speak up, you might create more trouble, more confusion, because you don't know what is the right action, what is the right speech. In this case, you're about to massacre people in the battle. What do you do? And that's the crisis, which is an evolutionary crisis at the same time a spiritual crisis, both individually and collectively. In that sense, in humanity today, we are at that poise. The difference is what happened in the Mahabharata involved a physical war and a physical destruction. Here it is no more physical, it is psychological. It is a psychological battle standing for what is true versus what is false. Forces which are progressive, forces which are regressive. Forces which will unite and bring forward a deeper unity, forces which will divide and create conflict and division. And if you sit silent and say, I will be neutral, you are giving free way exactly to the opposite forces. And yet when you speak or when you act, You have to be completely selfless. Otherwise, your agitation, your excitement, your personal interest will warp, will cloud from the pure action. And this is the challenge Arjuna has. If he does things by his normal standards, I do, I conquer, I win the battle, and he can do it, the result is terrible and terrifying, both for him and for everyone. And the only poise available Sri Krishna leads him to is remove yourself completely, becoming a completely transparent instrument with no personal interest. Let the divine will lead. In that case, it was in a physical battle. In this case, it is in a spiritual battle, we may say. Sri Aurobindo observes in a letter to Sahanadi, he says, it was in a context where she asked him, should I sit silent when somebody abuses you and keep a poise of equality? Or should I speak up? And he says, if the goal of our yoga was to withdraw from life, then to sit silent would be the right thing. But since here the goal is to bring into life a new consciousness, a new possibility, he says there are immense forces organized against this. And at that point, to be silent would be to give them free play. So you have to speak up, you have to stand for what is right. And then he says, it would be so much simpler to understand this if the attack was physical. Just because it is psychological does not make it any less dangerous. And so this is the situation Arjuna is at, and he has to act. And at that point, the action will be such that there will be massive karmic results. And Sri Krishna points out, only if he acts from this poise of immersion in the divine consciousness, with no personal interest and no personal engagement, then he says, he is not bound by his works, nor do they leave any after effects or consequences in his mind, nor cling to or leave any mark on his soul. And he gives in the footnote the reference, Na karma lipyate nare. This is from the Isha Upanishad. When thus we act in attunement with the divine will, with no personal desire, then the consequence does not touch, does not cleave, does not attach karmically. Now this we can understand, it's not a moral question, it is also a reality of the way things work. As long as you are a piece and you engage with a piece, you hit, there is a response, there is a reaction, there is a collision. That's the karma. Physically, karma is easy to understand by the principle of action and reaction. I push and I am pushed back. I cannot push without being pushed back. The karma here is instant, equal and opposite. When they call it Newton's law of action and reaction. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, is a karmic law in matter. But the same principle exists psychologically. When in myself I throw an energy, there is the energy which is my own energy, my own consciousness, is therefore mine. Returning to me because it was always a part of me, never really separate because it is my consciousness. And so in time there is a displacement. The result comes back after a while. It is not instant. Unlike in physical matter where it is instant, in the psychological domain there is a time lag. Equally, because in the vital and mental domains form is not priority. In the material world the form is also the same. But in the psychological domain the form is not the priority, it's the quality of energy, quality of consciousness that comes back to you. So a person who is used to always criticizing, abusing, thinking ill of others is throwing out so much clutter, eventually is surrounded by the same clutter, junk of emotions or thoughts, that they suffocate themselves. But when they engage with circumstances in the world, they come with this baggage which they bring into the circumstance. So in the physical circumstance, that same baggage comes back to them. The hatred that I am carrying with me is what now engages with the person I am interacting with to come back to me. And so the karma is almost an inevitable process because you are what is pushing and it comes back to you. Because everything is one whole. If you think of the whole universe as a pool of energy, of water, if you push the water, where will the push go? Eventually, it spreads all over, including you. But because it is your energy and has the same vibrational quality, you attract it much more than other things. And so it comes back to you. You push water, eventually it creates a swirl around you. That's the karma. The swirl may be big or small, but that's the karma. So when you think of it purely mechanistically, it's obvious. An individual unit pushing will have karma. But if your consciousness is one with the whole ocean moves against what? Nothing. There is no against. There is no karma. So the action is of a very different character. When your consciousness is one with the whole and an effort is made, everything is at the same time in alignment. There's a kind of a deep-rooted spontaneous harmony across. There is no collision of forces against forces. And so nothing sticks, nothing holds, the swirl moves, but you are never in it. And so he describes it like this. He is not bound by his works, nor do they leave any after effects or consequences in his mind, nor cling or leave any mark on his soul. So 3 levels of the karmic action are described. First, whatever we do, because of the ripple effect, we are bound by the very energy that we release. So I threw out hatred, well, the hatred attaches itself to me and it is now part of my baggage. If I have pushed to change a certain situation or hurt or help someone, there is a personal engagement in my effort. I am bothered by this. I've tied myself to the extent that I'm helping because I care for you. My caring is the attachment which binds me, and if you refuse or if you contradict, I am hurt. In the act of engaging, because of the personal passion of engagement, we are bound. How much are we bound? It's an interesting exercise to introspect upon. Right now, if you could see in the clairvoyant sight, you would find around the little bubble of your personal aura, there are links like cords, connections going out to the things and the people which obsess you. I'm using the word obsess because it's a strong word. Who are the people you're most worried about? Who are the people you're most attached to? What are the people you most hate? Now, loving somebody with attachment or hating somebody is also attachment, and they're equal, energetically. So you may love nobody and hate 5 people, but you still are bound to them because you hate. Or you love 5 people, you have hate for nobody, you're still bound to them. And so the more you have engaged and attached yourself to people, they're actually cords which connect you. And when they go through difficulty, the cord pulls you and your heart jumps. Sometimes when you hear of their pain, your heart jumps. Sometimes you don't hear, but on a subtle level they are in distress, you feel the distress. They're a part of you because you bound yourself. But the same is true of circumstances. I have dedicated my whole life to building this. This is my baby. People will use this word when they built an institution. It's my baby. What do they mean? There is this umbilical which has tied to you. How can I let go? How can I give it up in someone else's hands? You won't look after it the way I have looked after it. I cannot let go. And it's painful for people when they suddenly lose that power or they're suddenly removed. They go into depression, they feel this hollowness, and something never lets go of the attachment. And this is this hard way we learn, unfortunately. So the first level of the action of karma is being bound by the works. The fact that you put yourself into the work, you tied yourself to it, you are bound by it. Tomorrow if it succeeds, you rise. Tomorrow if it falls, you fall. I had a friend once who was playing in the stock market, and he was dealing with others, helping them. And he made this observation. I notice whenever the stock market goes up, the faces of all my clients, they go up. And when the stock market falls, they are crestfallen. Why? Because you've energetically connected yourself. I had occasion to meet people who were playing, who were big bulls in the market. And I had seen them at close hand. And one thing I noticed, they didn't care. First was, they had a huge vitality. Because you're playing with energies, money, power, and huge pull of energy. The whole stock market is a gigantic bundle of energy going, fluctuating, and millions of people tied to it. These people had a huge vitality to be able to play that energy, and they could pull and push largely because of that. Second thing, they didn't care. They didn't care about anybody. They were completely insular, all about themselves. Now, it's not a healthy condition. I'm not praising it. But the truth of it was, they didn't care what happens. They could win, they could lose, and they could be above it on some level. As a result, they could play. What happens with the stock market, why people lose, because they bind themselves to it, and the market plays them energetically. You are afraid and you put your money. You are attached and you put your money. The desire and greed which drives you is what makes you the victim, therefore you always lose. The same in gambling, the same energy, the same relation. But these people, they knew how to disconnect. They could see the market rising and they could sense what it wants to do next. They could sense when it's about to turn energetically, and they could pull back from the personal attachment and do something contrary to the current direction of the market. That's how they could win. Now I'm just explaining the principle on a much more exaggerated scale, but this is what happens in our life. As long as we are attached, we are bound, and it plays us rather than we play it. And we don't realize that. So he is not bound by his works, first change. Second, nor do they leave any after effects or consequences in his mind. The incident has happened, the story is over, and I'm still thinking about it. How many times have you seen or heard people say, I can never forgive that person for having done this? Why? The poor fellow was not even conscious of what he did. Maybe he did you harm, but you have held on to this. In this beautiful story from the yogic tradition, Buddhist tradition. So there's two monks which are going to cross a river, and there's this woman who says, I don't have money for a boat, there's no boat, can you carry me across? So the head monk takes her on his back, crosses the river, lets her off, and they walk. After an hour, the junior monk says, I can't contain myself. Master, how is it you're a celibate and monk and you took a woman on your back and carried her? You let her hug you. How can this be? And the senior monk says, oh, you're still carrying her. I left her behind on the shore. It's the psychological attachment. I'm still carrying in my mind the burden, and then I complain that my life is full of burdens. Now, when we think about it like this, it seems so obvious. But if you actually start introspecting and look at all the burdens we carry from our childhood, okay, many of them are subconscious. Maybe I was beaten up and there's a deep association in my body I'm not conscious of. But the things you're conscious of, you still carry them. When I was small, so-and-so used to harass me, I still look at his face and I feel disturbed. Petty rivalries, sibling jealousies, all of these are part of that. And do you realize, once you drop this body and take the new body, you will remember none of it? Do you need to drop the body and start afresh? Can you not drop it now? And all that has happened in the past, whatever someone may have done to you or not done, Just refuse to keep it with you. Let it go. Leave it behind in the past. And you can literally disengage and experience something like a new birth right now. And right now you get up like a little child, newborn, and look at your life and the opportunities before you and the people you have to deal with and start fresh. And of course you keep the lessons of the past. Such and such a person is not reliable in this issue. But I start fresh. Why not? Isn't it? And in this way we can remain young, because then we stop being pulled back. We are no more bound by the past. Otherwise the primary reason for aging psychologically, I'm not speaking of biology, the psychological aging is because so much of us is still living in the past that we are stopped from moving forward. There's so many threads pulling us. We're unable to take a step forward. And if you cut it all out, it's not easy the first time, but you start with the things which are most obvious. And then bit by bit the finer layers will come forward and say, now release me, release me. And layer by layer you'll find you get free. Until such time comes when you find yourself so light, so free, you can move forward rapidly, every day, even every moment. And you look back at what happened a week ago and you say, that feels like a different life. I'm a new person and everything is new and I do what I can in the present situation. Mother used to live like that. She would see people deep down, all the way through, seeing even all their worst. And she would deal with the best, always draw out the best, deal with that, knowing full well their limitations and finding means to work around them. Not always successful, failing many times. And she would pick up and move on. I remember Lalji Bhai's brother, I think. He mentioned to me how when they were working for the Auroville project, they had prepared a report which was to be submitted to a foundation in the US which had agreed to fund the whole thing. And if that had happened, everything would have moved rapidly forward. Mother herself signed as chairman of the society at that time. She signed that project report and it was sent. Meanwhile, somebody else in the same institution prepared a second report of his own and sent it with his signature. And those people got 2 reports and said, what is this internal politics? We don't want to get involved. They backed out. And this poor man who had worked, he came to the mother crying. And imagine, who's supposed to be crying here? Whose project is it? This man is crying and the mother is consoling him. Don't worry, it's not your problem, it's my problem. And she's smiling and moves on. The next moment, it's done, it's over. What do you do next? Move on. Not one criticism of the person who messed it up or the people, nothing at all. At every moment, forward and forward. So this is the second aspect of karma. Nor do they leave any after effects or consequences in his mind. And one of the after effects we have is, I'm damaged. Because of that event, I'm permanently damaged. I'm always afraid. I'm always, whatever it is, the damage of my past experiences of life. If you observe carefully inside you, something in you clings to that. That's why the damage remains. Sometimes it is semi-conscious because there's a drama of it. You know, I was beaten up so badly, that fellow abused, and the drama of and the self-importance it gives to me, that's the reason I keep it. If I actually let go, the fears and the other imprints which come with that whole painful experience, they also fade out. And this is true even biologically. I'll just give you an example. Often you have a scar mark from an injury. The scar mark is body trying to repair itself but not doing it perfectly. And the scar doesn't go away. Although the body is renewing all the cells are being replaced every 7 years. And yet the scar is rebuilt. Why? Because somewhere in the physical consciousness the memory is retained of the injury. And the body accepts this memory and so builds around the memory the distortion. And the same happens in our psychological levels. I found this very interesting when I was in kindergarten. I must have been at that time 4 or 5 years old. We had a metal buckle in those days with a sharp edge, and I remember once it was a little loose, my hand scraped against it and I had a cut here. It bled, first time, traumatic. I found it 20 years later. I was 25, I was 30, 35. The scar is still there. And then I said to myself, something is wrong. If my body has grown, I was at that time so small. Everything has been replaced. Even my bones have become bigger. And all the bone cells have gone. Why is the scar still here? I don't know what it was, but something in me said, no, this is not acceptable. Interestingly, 10 years later, I noticed, where's the scar? This was after 35. Last I remember seeing it when I was 35. And about 10 years later, I noticed it was gone. Interestingly, when I noticed it, I had to struggle to remember which arm was it. Was it my right arm or my left arm? I didn't remember. You see? As long as the memory was there somewhere in the body consciousness, the scar remained. When the memory was gone, I had trouble remembering which arm it was. And there was no scar anymore. So the psychological state, scarring on a psychological level and a scarring on a physical level, they are deeply connected. And often it happens, the psychological scarring becomes a physical illness because of the strong, passionate pain in the stomach, abdominal region. It affects certain glandular processes there. You have diabetes or digestion problems or acidity problems or whatever issue it is. They're deeply connected. And one can consciously let go and start with what's easy right now, what you're conscious of. Every morning, make this effort. Let all the past fade out. If you like, do it before sleeping, you fade out the past. Whatever has happened, you give it to the mother and say, here, it's all yours. It's no more mine. I start afresh now. New life, new birth. Go to sleep with that and wake up with that. And do this a few days and you will find a great relief and a great release. So this is the second type of the karmic consequence, which is on the after effects or consequences in the mind. And then we come to the third. Nor cling to or leave any mark on his soul. Wow, this is more serious. Something much deeper. And soul here need not be the inmost soul, it is just the sense of I, independent. The sense of I, and at the deepest level it is the part on me which carries over into the next life. And imprints can remain and karmic imprints carry over in this way. And there is even a choice that the soul makes in life when it prepares for a new birth. It can choose what part of the karma it wants to use up, because if all of it were to come up, it would be too much, it might be overwhelmed. So the soul can choose which aspect and parts of the karma are useful for the current direction of life experience, and it uses and brings those forward to be worked out. But all karma, Mother explains, all karma is belonging only to the lower levels, because it's part of the action-reaction process. For the divine grace, it is possible to intervene and change everything. Why? Because it acts from the consciousness of unity. It can dissolve, modify anything. And Mother says, either the grace intervenes to dissolve the karma, or it can use the same karma for a different outcome. You see, there are forces working on you right now to trouble you. Fine, the divine grace is all right. There's a good opportunity to help you develop equality. So the same force is used for a deep development of your inner equality, and once that is done, poof, the problems fade out. Or the divine grace can completely change anything. And there are many examples we know of such. One was a story told to me by one of the ashram sadhaks. I don't remember anymore the names and details. But it was that in their family, they had somebody who was going through a very severe passage, including physical problems and health problems. And the astrologer had said this is part of whatever cycle of such and such a planet, it will go on for so many more years. So obviously they went and reported to the mother. And the next day, it was gone. And the next day, it was not there. And a few weeks passed, no sign of any of those problems. So they went back and reported to the mother and said, "Mother, since we informed you, the whole thing has gone, it's vanished, it stopped." And mother said, "Yes, naturally, I erased his karma." And she said, "I erased his destiny." Whatever was the rhythm set, that's what makes for your destiny. What you are is much more your destiny than what you do. Because what you do is an outcome of what you are. And that's what really the horoscope captures. You change that, all the ripple effects, everything changes. And she could intervene just like that, poof, gone. Many examples of this kind where somebody else, it was prophesied by the astrologer, he will die within 15 days. And so they reported to the mother. And mother said, "Go out and inform everybody that this is the prediction." And so they followed, they informed everybody. And of course, 15 days later, nothing happened and he was fine and he lived for a very long time. In another case, the doctor came and told the mother, "So-and-so patient has only one functional lung, the other lung is completely damaged." And mother said to him, "Don't tell him a word of it." And the fellow lived on one functional lung for many decades after, never knowing that he had this problem. I'm placing these two examples deliberately. And if you look deeply, you'll understand why. With the lungs, if you were told, "Oh, you have only one functional lung," what's the next thing will happen? "Oh, I have to be careful, I have to be conscious, I have to reduce, and automatically all your worries will exaggerate and turn it into a problem. He didn't know, he worked normally, everything was fine. Because the body has a capacity to adapt, and of course with the help of the grace. The other case, where there was a prophecy from someone else, one based on astrology or whatever it is, doesn't matter. A prophecy has a force of fulfillment. You see, when an astrologer says, "This will happen to you," in his mind there's a very strong need for it to be fulfilled. Because if he's wrong, it's his reputation at stake. So when he tells you something negative, effectively it's a curse. Not intentionally, but he wants it to happen. And if you notice carefully, you will find some of them, they take pleasure in saying negative things. It gives them a kind of a high of excitement. I said it and it happened. And if it doesn't happen, they're disappointed. They'll come and check. "Didn't I tell you?" So it's a force. Mother saw the force. What's the best way to break it? Dissipate it. Of course, she did her part, but by dissipating, by spreading it out to everybody, suddenly the force had no more the pinpoint focus. It was dissipated and it had no effect. So anyway, these are just indications, but the idea we were coming to was there are things which affect you deeply, which can carry over. And especially where something is done which Mother say, in the traditions, they speak of it as utkata karma, the part of karma which is so dense that even the divine grace will not intervene. Those are the kinds of things where you have interfered with somebody else's freedom, as in the case of a murder, or something where you interrupted the freedom of a soul or its development. And the karmic consequence of that, even the divine grace does not intervene. For everything else, the tradition says, the grace can intervene and change. So, even across lives, there are things which continue to pursue because they touch us so deeply, or because we engaged as deeply on that level. I had a very interesting example of a positive side of this. I was with somebody who is a spiritually awakened teacher in his own lineage, different lineage, and he met someone in the group. We were part of a conference. He met someone in a group, and soon after, the lady who met him came and told me, "Oh, he is accepted to take me as a student." And then he told me later, I saw her and I recognized her as somebody who was my student in the previous incarnation, and there was a work left to be done. And because it's my responsibility, I had to make her the offer, do you want to be my student? And she said yes. And when in the way she said yes, even for her it was surprising, and it was the right thing. And I know, because I knew the history a little bit, for the last 2 years before that, she was looking for somebody. Her own teacher in which she had grown up, that lineage was not sufficient. She was looking for somebody. She had even been reading Sri Aurobindo. And suddenly she met this man, and poof, there was a recognition, it was done. But the thing there was, on his side, he was conscious that there was a work remaining, and it was his duty to make the offer. She could have said no. But in these cases, it is more the soul's recognition and its call which comes forward at that moment. So there are complex connections we have. Positive, negative, all kinds. Some of them are part of a group, not even of individual levels. When Mother makes this comment that we were all together many times in preparation for this, preparing for the new world, all of us were part of this. That's why we're here now. And she said, you were promised that when the time comes for the fulfillment, you will be given a chance, and that's why you're here. And she says, you don't remember, but I remember. Now all of us are in that sense bound on some level, connected. Is it karma? Yes, maybe a kind of a collective karma of having worked together for a common vision, goal, ideal, for a divine mission. But much more than connection among us, we are connected to the divine, because that was the link that we built and we worked for. And from the divine side, she takes responsibility. He takes responsibility for us far more than even when we don't remember, far more than we could even with our best efforts. That for us is the most important link of our soul. So at the level of the soul, there might be things, connections here and there, but what matters and what is most important for us is the link we have with the divine and the bond we have built up there. Mother makes this observation that when she met somebody for the first time, she created a connection with the psychic being, a connection which stays for lives together, where she took responsibility for them. Now this means with the psychic being, it stays for lives. Other bonds we have of family and other ties, they pass. We don't even know who was our brother, mother, sister's child in previous lives. All gone. At best, if there was a strong, deep inner contact, we may meet occasionally and say, so and so is familiar, I feel very parental towards you. That's about it. It fades out with that. But with the divine, it's so deep. And she taking responsibility for us means even when we forget, she reaches deep within and helps us to wake up. So this is the third aspect of the karma. And we will take the rest of the text later, simply to read the sentence which finishes, they vanish, the consequences of the works and karmas. They vanish and are dissolved by their very execution and leave the immutable self unaffected and the soul unmodified. But this too is not the goal. There's one more step where these two sides, the passive and the active Brahman, have to be fused, united in experience. And that, how that is done is the rest of the text, which we will continue after 1 month, because I'll be out of station from next week, and the continuance will not be here anymore. It will be in Pondicherry at my residence, because we've been asked to stop the classes here. And those of you who are unable to come to Pondicherry, you're welcome to watch online. As you can see, the classes are webcast on a YouTube channel. You can take the name, it will be distributed as you go out, the name of the channel. And we'll continue this text after a week, after a month. Any comments, any questions? Yes.
I beg you first, thank
Yes.
you so much. You give answer about this situation, actual situation.
Yes.
Everything. Thank you.
Thank you. So the 1 month later will be November 24th, which is the Friday. So we will have the class as usual. Any other comments or questions?
And I tell you something in Agenda 1972. Sri Aurobindo said to Mother, I don't know the date, L to Satkhand, the woman is the next step of evolution. Iklim is a transition from the past to the supernova. In 26 April 1972.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
But it's very, very, and Mother said, I explained many times, but in 1972, 1962, she said to Satkhand, after 15 years, 2012, I come back, finish my agenda. But now it's in the world.
Yes. Yes. The aspect of what we call the feminine aspect of the manifestation will take a much greater force now. And in humanity, therefore, there will be a shift even in the gender balance as a result. Yes.
Tell exactly every date when Mother gives
Yes.
everywhere.
Yes.
Agenda spéciale,
Yes.
no mistake.
I have a question. The yoga you described today, where the consciousness is mainly dwelling in the passive Brahman, while the action is done by force itself. Is this mainly the yoga described in the Gita?
Yes.
In contradiction to Aurobindo, what he described later, where you integrate the active Brahman into action.
So even in the Gita, the suggestion is there that from this poise there is a still higher poise, which is the poise of the Purushottama, where you are above both the active and the passive, and you are master of both. That is there in the Gita. But in the integral yoga, that becomes the most important focus then. Yes. Okay. The question is who Sri Aurobindo was most influenced by, whether the Gita or the Upanishads or the Veda, etc. Sri Aurobindo himself, when he started the yoga, it was not because of something he read or from any other teaching. It was by a spontaneous inner awakening where he received the guidance from the Lord of the yoga within himself. And that is what led him. Subsequently, as he moved through certain experiences, he was interested to see if they corresponded with anything in the traditions. And he began to study the various scriptures. And he found very close correspondence, even exact correspondence with certain experiences in the Veda and in the Upanishads and the Gita particularly, these three particularly. And as a result, he wrote extensively commentaries on these three, but with the approach of his own experience, which is different from the way these three texts are presented today in many of the existing traditions, which see these texts from a renunciate or life-abandoning spirituality. Sri Aurobindo saw them from a life-affirming spirituality. And so his commentaries are in content quite different from other commentaries. And they make much more sense and they have greater consistency across the texts. But his approach was from the guidance that he received directly in his sadhana. But we can see how much in a text which is so simple, we have barely covered a page. Every word is suggestive of some deeper insight, and everything leads to a shift in your perspective of yourself, the world, and even the yoga. And so if you read it in this way, the whole text takes you from experience to experience, deepening, widening, and making more complete. And we are different as a result. We can end with a chant of Om together. Om.